next it's my pleasure to introduce someone who hardly needs any introduction, actually, to most of those who have dealt with the topic of climate engineering, namely Oliver Morton from The Economist. But I would like to introduce Oliver and give you a little bit of a perspective into his breadth and into the fortune that we have that he's delved so deeply and stuck with us so long with this topic of climate engineering. Oliver writes about scientific and technological changes and their effects. He concentrates particularly on the understanding and imagining of planetary processes. And boy, can I tell you about imagining. I got a little sneak preview of his talk already. He's a senior editor at The Economist, responsible for the magazine's briefings and essays. He was previously chief news and features editor at Nature and the editor of Wired UK, and has contributed to a wide range of other publications. He writes on subjects from quantum physics to synthetic biology to movie making. His articles have been anthologized and won awards. He's the author of 3 books, Mapping Mars, The Science, Imagination, and Birth of a World in 2002, which was shortlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. Then he wrote Eating the Sun, How Plants Power the Planet in 2007, a book of the year in The Spectator and the Times Literary Supplement. And then finally, he wrote what many of us are familiar with, The Planet Remade, How Geoengineering Could Change the World in 2015, which was longlisted for the Samuel Johnson Prize and shortlisted for the Royal Society Book Prize. In the Sunday Times, Brian Appleyard described it as ambitious, enthralling, and slightly strange. He's an honorary professor in the Department of Science, Technology, Engineering, and Public Policy, which sort of covers all of his various interests, at UCL, University College of London, and has a degree in the History and Philosophy of Science from Cambridge University. And most important of all, the asteroid 10716, Oliver Morton, is named in his honor. Oliver is going to talk to us tonight about re-engineering and reimagining the Earth. Oliver.
Hi, thank you all very much for that warm welcome. Thank you very much, Mark. To talk about climate geoengineering is to talk about humans and nature, and it is thus to join in a conversation that has been going on for centuries and will continue, if we are spared, for centuries to come. That conversation takes place in everyday life. It takes place in farms and in forests. It takes place in books and lecture halls. It takes place in churches and temples, and, though not as much as it should, in parliaments. It takes place in science fiction and in the world of art. It takes place in curves, in lines, in landscapes. Here is part of that conversation, The Oxbow by Thomas Cole, arguably the first masterpiece by undoubtedly America's first great landscape artist. On the left, you have wild nature, a windswept wilderness dominated by a signifier of nature's power that you find throughout Cole's work, the lightning-blasted tree. On the right, the almost domesticity of Arcadia, a landscape that is conspicuously cared for. To many American settlers, the story of their progress was the story of this second landscape replacing the first, of the continent as a whole, specifically including its wild, un-European climate, being tamed by the spread of yeoman farmers and their transformation of the land. The presence of civilization in and of itself was an act of geoengineering. And yet Cole's picture is not as simple as that. There is humanity in the wilderness, the painter himself, a parasol cheekily piercing the painting's great divide, what might be an easel or might be a cross. And there is nature and its power for change in Acadia. The course of the river meandering through the lowlands will change and change again. The lines and curves of history are not a simple matter of one half of the painting coming to dominate the other. When the organisers of CEC17 were kind enough to ask me to speak 3 years ago at CEC14, I read a little bit of what was then a work in process and is now my book, The Planet Remade. The passage was about the great black bowl of the stratosphere's sky, the bright curved rim of the Earth, and the straight dark line of the wing. A human intervention that made imagining this strange part of the world possible, and thus also had to be a part of that imagining. You can't paint the wilderness without going into it, parasol and all. My purpose in talking about the stratosphere was, of course, to talk about aerosols and albedo modification, about deliberately creating a planetary parasol. Here is the veil of such particles thrown up by Mount Pinatubo. In this painting of Cotopaxi, Frederick Church, Thomas Cole's greatest pupil, captures the sublime natural power of such parasol unfurling events and seems, to me, to beautifully evoke the poetry and peril of an occluded sun. In talking not just about the stratosphere, but about the wings that let you experience it, I was trying, in part, to add a touch of the technological sublime, and in so doing, to add a human element. You can't, I said, imagine the world changed without imagining the means of that change. You can't imagine the means without the motive. One of the burdens of my book was to argue that to see the motive for climate geoengineering by wings or any other means as control was both unrealistic and dangerous. A better motive, I suggested, is care. So let us look at the ideas of a planet under constant care. The Scientific Adventures of Baron Munchausen is a novel of sorts by Hugo Gernsback, who was in essence the inventor of science fiction in its 20th century American form. A radio enthusiast in Massachusetts picks up messages from beyond the Earth. They turn out to come from Baron Munchausen, who is traveling first to the Moon and then to Mars and wants to describe the wonders that he sees. Among the extraordinary things that Munchausen encounters on Mars are vast cubes of wire mesh hung above the surface, charged with unearthly currents. They glow with a startling purple light. These machines, which are not visible, alas, in the Martian vista I show you here, which is just one of those run-of-the-mill pictures that gets sent back across millions of kilometers by wandering robots these days, turns out to be the Martians' air-purifying plants. They scrub carbon dioxide from the planet's atmosphere and turn it into a precipitate which fills what the Baron takes to be the Martians' special agricultural requirements. The Martians care for their planet not piecemeal, like farmers taming the wilderness, but with a technological network that covers the whole globe. It seems awe-inspiring and deeply alien, but as the Baron asks his interlocutor in the last line of the book, how long will it be with your coal-burning machinery till the Earth's atmosphere will need cleaning plants? Gernsback's Scientific Adventures, published in magazine form in 1915, did not make much of an impact, and it has not aged gracefully, and in truth it wasn't very good in the first place. It does not have the grandeur of Percival Lowell's books on Mars as the abode of life, books which introduced the idea of Martians banding together to respond to their homeworld's desertification through the creation of great linear canals. I came across Gernsback's book by chance, browsing in a Minneapolis bookshop called, entirely uncoincidentally, Uncle Hugo's. Those last lines, though, jumped out at me. They still do. How long will it be with your coal-burning machinery till the Earth's atmosphere will need cleaning parts? In Paris, 100 years later, this forgotten bit of pulp fiction got its answer. A large body of technical opinion now sees, or hopes to see, or pretends to see, the atmospheric cleaning plants starting to come online in about 40 years or so. The vast body of popular opinion, meanwhile, has not yet caught on that these things are under serious consideration at all, or what their implementation might entail. They will not be grids of wire glowing in an unearthly purple, or necessarily lines across landscapes like this one I'm showing you. They could be vast plantations feeding power stations or interventions into ocean ecosystems, and they could, then as now, remain stuck in our imaginations. When Gernsback was writing his Tall Tales, the carbon dioxide level on Earth was 300 parts per million, and the global mean surface temperature, according to Hadkut 4, was about 1 degree less than it was last year. We know these numbers. We need to appreciate them. The century that separates us from Gernsback, the 5th century of the transatlantic economy, the 3rd century of the capitalist economy, the 2nd century of industrial revolution, the 1st century of globalized fossil fuel extraction, was almost also the 1st century in human history that was geophysically significant in and of itself. In situating our discussions, it is vital to remember that this change was not a surprise. It was clearly seen by the sort of people that Gernsback read, people like Svante Arrhenius, who calculated the greenhouse effect of rising carbon dioxide levels, and Alfred Lotka, who in 1925 provided what I still see as a remarkable encapsulation of humanity's new relationship with nature in the context of geological time and planetary scale. The process of fossilization, Lotka wrote, has furnished the occasion for a phenomenon which, judged in a cosmic perspective, represents a purely ephemeral flare, but which to us, the human race, is of altogether transcendent importance. Biologically, we are changing radically the complexion of our share in the carbon cycle by throwing into the atmosphere from coal fires and metallurgical furnaces 10 times as much carbon dioxide as the natural processes of breathing. These human agencies alone would, in the course of about 500 years, double the amount of carbon dioxide in the entire atmosphere. The time scale is wrong. The insight and its depth is correct. When people look back on our conversations here in 100 years, will they say the same thing? Gernsback's ideas about the Martians engineering their carbon cycle with what we would now call direct air capture were, I think, unique. But their thrust was not. The idea that there were Martians, that they were advanced beyond the inhabitants of the Earth, and that they were involved in engineering their planetary environment was widely speculated upon. Not all scientists believed in the Martians, nor was to talk as if you believed in the Martians necessarily to take them seriously. They were, in large part, a rhetorical device. But though belief was not universal and came in various gradations, no one, I think, argued that, if there were Martians, they could not possibly be trying to care for their planet's failing climate through a global network of canals. It seemed a reasonable thing. After all, had not the Earth been networked itself by telegraphs and by steam? Though by Gernsback's time it was electricity which illuminated the imagination, he and everyone else knew that the great mover of progress had been steam, that it was steam which had ushered in, no, pounded in, driven home modernity. As John Stuart Mill wrote in his review of de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, the way in which the railroad allowed everyone to move changed everything, including government. Society, history was given direction. The new and the next, always a destination. The past, always left behind. As Turner showed in this masterpiece, Rain, Steam and Speed, the arrow of history now cut through the landscape, threatened to burst from the canvas. In the coming age, there was no longer to be a sinuous line between the wilderness and the cultivated. Steam's motive and emotive power was at one with the elements, a technology capable of competing with nature in the production of the sublime. Thermodynamics, the science of steam engines, was the science of the age, explaining the world and the cosmos to Arrhenius, to Lotka and their like. Steam allowed humans to be, if not like gods, then at least like the titans who fought with them. Listen to Lord Byron, writing the decade before Turner painted this picture. Where shall we set bounds to the power of steam? Who shall say, thus far shalt thou go and no farther? Might not the fable of Prometheus and his stealing the fire be but traditions of steam and its machinery? Who knows whether, when a comet shall approach this globe to destroy it, men will not tear rocks from their foundations by means of steam, and hurl mountains as the giants are said to have done against the flaming mass. And then we shall have traditions of titans again, and of wars with heaven. And there we have it, the titanic idea of Prometheus, reimagined from the distant past to the present, the great, doomed, well-intentioned, careless gift giver. Here he is a century later. Oh, no, he's not. There's a slide missing there. If you saw that slide, you would be able to see a picture of Prometheus on the cover of one of Gernsback's science fiction magazines, a story about bringing down the fire of atomic energy to the surface of the Earth in a good way. Because to romantics like Byron and Shelley, and to technophiles like Gernsback, Prometheus was a hero. Yet others saw things as more complex. The endeavors of the Prometheus of modern times, wrote Immanuel Kant, are proofs of the boldness of man, allied with a capacity which stands in a very modest relationship to that boldness. Ultimately, they lead him to the humbling reminder, which is where he ought properly to start, that he is never anything more than a human being. It is easy and true to say that that humbling reminder is something which all of us who think about climate geoengineering as a possible form of planetary care must take to our hearts. It is harder to say how, so reminded, to move forward. Perhaps it helps to know that the Prometheus Kant was writing of was a specific person. It was Benjamin Franklin, who sought with his lightning rods, here on his house in Philadelphia, to disarm the thunder by pulling fire from the sky. This technology was deeply controversial. At one level, the debate was a technical one about whether lightning rods should be knobbly-ended or pointy-ended, about whether they reduced risks or, rather crucially, increased them. At another level, it was anything but technical. It was a debate about how and when, and on whose account, humans might challenge nature and the natural order, and if they did so, what else they might challenge too. Shelley's Prometheus is a political, not a technological hero. The Promethean Franklin took part in the sundering of an old kingdom and the creation of a new republic. Today, lightning conductors are for the most part a closed story. Pointiness and knobbliness are no longer issues. The risk calculus is well understood. Concerns about lightning and buildings have largely been taken care of. Lightning can now be played with, even aestheticized. Here is Walter Lemaria's lightning field, where lines in the landscape, strangely reminiscent, to me at least, of the grids in the Martian landscape that Gernsback imagined, draw arcs of fire from the sky for no reason other than that they can. As lightning conductors then, geoengineering today, a Promethean science in exactly the way that the historian Simon Schaffer, my teacher, my mentor and my friend, defines the term in an essay on the lightning conductor controversies. Promethean science, Schaffer teaches us, is an experimental enterprise that mixes a vaulting ambition to safeguard humanity with the troubling hazards of following this science's recipes. Some may take this in a rather positive way. What was Promethean becomes, in time, pragmatic. Technical controversies are resolved. Great questions are set aside. Maybe in 100 years, that is how all this will look. But I want to focus on something that divides the two subjects and their time periods. That climate geoengineering is prey to hubris, there is no doubt. But what of Franklin-like radicalism? Concerns about geoengineering have an interesting divergence. In terms of the Earth system, The risks are deemed catastrophic, none more so, perhaps, than the much-vaunted termination shock in which the stratospheric parasols are closed and the full weight of warming dropped down from the heavens. It is literally an apocalyptic vision, in that the literal meaning of apocalypse is an unveiling. It reveals the truth behind. Take away the veil and see what happens. This torn apocalypse by Gerhard Richter, Rarate coeli de super, drop down, ye heavens, seems apposite. And yet, politically, the critique of climate geoengineering is almost the reverse. Not that it brings sudden change, but that it forestalls it, that its moral hazard hampers the drive to decarbonize, that it allows the world to continue as it is, even as the underlying reality shifts, that it buys doomed capitalism at least a simulacrum of borrowed time. That it is, in a word we do not hear very much, but which seems very apt, catacalyptic. It draws up the veil, covering the sun, covering the need for change, covering the gulf humans are driving between themselves and some idea of nature. This, it seems to me, is a much deeper issue than the presumed apocalypse of termination. Let me put the sky back in its place. I do not know what a radical geoengineering looks like. I do not know if one is needed. But I worry that in our discussions, too often we treat politics as a fixed, a pro or anti-geoengineering context, while thinking of making the Earth system increasingly labile. We do not stop to think of how geoengineering, as part of a wider response to climate change, might be some part of something more broadly transformative, of how it could help bring about a caring world which we might, in time, trust with such Promethean power. Let me return to the beginning and find you two contemporary images that throw Cole's oxbow forward, some new lines in the landscape. Michael Light's magnificent picture of the Snake River again draws the line between humanity, now suburban, not Arcadian, and nature, but it does so with far greater dramming, far more foreboding. There are no curves here. The sky is gone. The wilderness is below, and it is hungry. There are, it seems, no compromises to be drawn, and yet the landscape persists. And then there is Andreas Gursky's Rhine 2. Here, all hint of conflict has been purged. Nature is pure, untrammeled. Sky, land, and water are independent blocks of being. Progress is gone. The path does not rush into or out of the picture, but crosses it as evenly as every other line. All other marks of humanity are expunged. Except humanity is everywhere in this highly processed picture, in the editing, in the removal, in the covering up. Catacalypse now. Gursky's humanity frames it all, providing from outside the picture a unique vision of stasis without claustrophobia, of a world beyond both energy and entropy. I have rarely seen a photograph more beautiful. When first I saw it in London's Tate Modern, I could only stop and stare, but it needs a contrast. Here is Olafur Eliasson's Weather Project, a vast installation actually created for the halls of Tate Modern. A hall where fossil fires powered huge turbines is illuminated by an artificial sun. The palette could not be further from Gursky's. All lines are straight or closed, nothing natural persists, and yet it is inhabited, appreciated from within by those figures on the floor with a surprising joy. It is a work that in its time in the gallery people came to care for. These two artworks may be fundamentally opposed, but maybe their closed and open visions are the same. I do not know. I want to think and to ask and to learn. To talk about climate geoengineering is to talk about humans and nature. To join that conversation is not just to take a stand within it. It is to listen to as much of it as you can. It is to listen to the now and to listen to the past, to feel for the lines and curves along which the conversation will carry on into the future, to respond to it and to be willing to play a role. It is to be aware, as Kant was, of our modest capacities, but it is also, when called upon, to be bold. I hope we have a magnificent conference.